Welcome to Guards Down. Join your host, Greg C. Washington, as he explores how people from various backgrounds have overcome bouts with trauma and complicated grief. If you're stuck, know someone who might be, or want to be in a position to help someone, you're in the right place. We can't wait to share the tips and tricks we've learned on our journey to healing and putting our guards down.
Hey, good morning and welcome to the next episode of Guards Down. I appreciate y'all coming on and listening to us. I have with me today a very special guest and a good friend of mine, Marshall Jackson. Marshall, good morning.
Hey, good morning. Good morning.
Good. Well, look, man, let's dig into this thing. We're talking about PTSD and complicated grief and how different cultures view, see, treat, and overcome it. So Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, man. Backstory. I was I call myself a semi-military brat growing up. Both of my parents were in the military. My mother got out right after I was born, and my dad stayed in. I don't want to say till I was like elementary school or so. So had the military experience down in Fort Hood and kind of bounced between California and DC till landed in DC. And grew up still in a military household. I think, even when your parents are not in the military anymore, you kind of still, align with those strictures, right, in the household. I didn't think I was going to go into the military. To be honest with you, I was really close to my dad and didn't really like the fact that he was gone for training and this, that, and the fourth, but ended up going to West Point, which was, probably one of the best decisions I've ever made, for myself personally. Then went into the military, was a Med Service Corps officer in the military, got out. Now I'm a practicing attorney here in DC area. And so that's been my journey, thus far.
Got you. And so to go from, I like being a semi-military brat, it's all in that, and you're a full military brat, no matter how you look at it. And then, not thinking about going into the military, and here you are, a part of, the world's most famous and one of the greatest academies and services of, West Point, and then going into the Army to be an officer. So my hat's definitely off to you there.
I appreciate you, brother. So
when you look at it, right, from a leadership standpoint, and like you were saying earlier, you come from a military family, and one of the things we talk about is looking at the military as a culture in itself, and not as your ethnic group. And so to hear that from the standpoint of, hey, I grew up in a military culture, family environment. You had certain values, certain things about yourself that were inherently instilled in you, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely. Look, my dad early on, I think a lot of people, even if you're not in the military, you try to teach your kids, certain values and instill in them certain values, work ethic, understanding that your character, is probably the most important thing about you, right? How you carry yourself. I think it was exacerbated, being in the military, family, especially my dad, who, interestingly enough, he was in the Army. And interesting story, kind of background there. Like I said, me and my dad are very close. And I kind of followed a bit in his footsteps. He was a medic in the Army. And then, when he transitioned off active duty, he went, reserves, and ended up going into the Air Force reserves, but obviously remained a medic. And me following in his footsteps, even in my military career, being a Med Service Corps officer, is very interesting. But those core values that he instilled in me early on, know yourself, know your worth, having amazing work ethic. Like, look, you may not always be, the smartest person in the room, but you can outwork and should outwork everybody, right? And you'll put yourself in a position to be around those people, and to put yourself in a position to be the smartest person in the room. Teamwork always. While I only have one sibling, I have a younger sister. I have many cousins, and my dad, kind of through him, him being, I think, one of 10 amongst his siblings, he really taught us the value of teamwork, not just in our family, but through sports. I grew up playing basketball and other sports, but the value of teamwork. And that carried through, right, until I got to West Point.
Got you. And with all of those trainings and, that character building that, he was still in you, did he or, your mom, the people around you, did they teach y'all about how to deal with trauma and grief as well?
Not directly. Not directly. I don't know if this is a product of, I spent most of my time with, I would say, my dad. But I don't know if it's a product of how just kind of men are in general, or even Black men in particular. But, there is a tendency to hide, or at least, kind of guard yourself against emotion, and not to share emotion. And then, by doing so, you're kind of not teaching, those around you, and even me, being taught by my dad, never really directly taught me how to deal with trauma and grief, and what to do with emotion, right? Other than indirectly saying, hey, if you're feeling something, kind of channel it through sports, which that's all good and well, right? But you're not necessarily dealing with the actual emotion of whatever you're going through. You are just kind of channeling it through something else, which could be good, and it's a double-edged sword. And I say indirectly because though he never said anything or kind of verbally taught me how to deal with grief and trauma and emotion, I watched my dad all the time, kind of see how he dealt with things in his life and adversities, whether it been in the military or when he got out, and he's now a clinician in the ER at Children's Hospital here in DC. Watching him grow up, things he's gone through in his life, personal issues, deaths in the family amongst his friends, like how has he dealt with those things? And so indirectly, I got to see, okay, he does this, he does that, this, from what my perspective was at the time growing up as a kid, and even now, it's like, I think this works for him. It seems like it works. And so I kind of put that in my toolkit, right? Not knowing whether it'll work for me at a later point in my life. But no, there was never like a direct, hey, let's really talk about how you deal with trauma. And I will say, from a personal perspective, my family had gone through some division, which for most kids, early on, was just kind of traumatic when your parents kind of split, right? And trying to figure things out. And it's like, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the emotion of that, right? And it was never a conversation. It was just like, okay, keep going,
I got you. Man, your dad sounds like a pretty awesome guy. Yeah, I mean, your mom as well, but it definitely sounds like you were taught like some really great things from your dad, and just how to persevere and push forward and set the example.
Yeah, no, he's been great. I'll say my mom is amazing as well. I kind of have always gravitated toward my dad, just for obviously, kind of life lessons and whatnot. Trying to learn to be a man. And I had actually three men in my life who were critical early on. And my father, my grandfather, actually my mother's father, also military Army vet, as well as my uncle, who is, I should say, my great uncle on my mother's side, who was a real mentor, role model to me. I always looked up to him. I actually wanted to be like him, and he was one of the reasons I actually decided to become an attorney, in my life. But they were able to instill, whether directly or indirectly, those character traits in me, have a positive influence in me. But to the point, even watching them, right? It was one of those things is you see they're going through something, or you know they're going through something, whether it be professionally or personally, and there was never a discussion of like, this is how you deal with it, right? Or this is how, let me teach you how to deal with the raw emotion that you're feeling, or the traumatic event. Um, and it was more of a, okay, you just keep going, like you just keep pushing, which is great from a, in terms of perseverance, because I think, persevering, and sometimes you just need to push through.
Yeah.
But you also have to, and I've learned this later on in life, you have to learn how to deal with whatever is going on, and that emotion and that feeling, right? Or it's just going to sit and fester, and it's going to manifest itself in other ways.
What's
And
been
I've seen that in myself. I've seen that in other people as well.
good? So what's been your experience with trauma and grief?
So, I mean, for me, I think it was kind of twofold, and I'll give you a little bit of the quick story. I did go to Afghanistan, and I spent time overseas, which was, eye opening for me on many levels, right? And I was attached to an infantry unit, as a Med Service Corps officer, helping to deploy our medical assets, right? In sector, and in that role, you see a lot of, trauma. You see, and not me necessarily being a healthcare provider, more of an administrator, but working with my medics, working with our PA and our doc, right? You see guys who have gotten blown up. You've seen guys who've gotten, legs and arms amputated. You've seen people shot. Kids. I mean, even, not just our U.S. soldiers, but even kids and local Afghanis, for one reason or another, being injured, and helping them in sector. Um, and the thing is, which I kind of talk to my medics about, and we talked all the time, and had in our debriefs, was like, look, through this experience, you're going to see a lot of stuff, right? And, obviously the first thing is to persevere and kind of push through some of the emotion, but you also have to deal with it. And even speaking to that to them, and not to say that I wasn't practicing what I was preaching, but at the same time, I was kind of pushing down, hey, you just got to finish the mission, keep going, right? And so, you get home, and then I transitioned out of the military. There were still things that I was dealing with, it just in terms of like, oh crap, the level of, death and trauma that I saw, not just to myself necessarily, but to other people. I lost one of my medics. We lost some folks that were some of the soldiers that were literally on our fob, when we got mortar attacked, right? And so you have to be able to deal with those thoughts and those visions, and the emotion that comes along with that. And it wasn't until I transitioned out of the Army that I started to really think about how did that affect me? And not just me, how did it affect, a bunch of my guys? Because we keep in contact. And I have other friends who, while they weren't deployed with me, personally, they were deployed after me or before me, and they've had their own experiences. And you see how, 5 years ago, kind of how their personality was and how their life was, and you see how things change. And you're seeing like there's a shift and change, and why is that, right? How, and they've just been affected, right? From PTSD, from trauma, from grief, and how are they dealing with it? And so it wasn't until I transitioned that I figured, I started to think, obviously thinking back to the things that my dad, other leaders and mentors that I've worked with, how do they deal with, the grief of things, the trauma of things, and what they put in their toolkit. And what I learned was, when you're putting tools in your toolkit, you have to put tools in your toolkit that work for you. And I was putting tools in my toolkit that worked for a lot of other people, and didn't utilize those tools maybe effectively, or at least they weren't effective for me. So while in a moment, yes, pushing through, redirecting my energy was great. But then for me, it like manifested, right? It just kind of sat there, and kind of, it eats at you a bit, right? And then it'll manifest itself in other ways, whether some people it's anger, some people it's eating, some people it's drinking, some people it's a whole bunch of other things, right? Thankfully, mine wasn't to an extreme, but then, some people are like, hey, you always were like this happy-go-lucky, optimistic guy. You still are, but there's like a little something different. And so I had to think about, okay, what's going on? How am I, dealing with things? And I would say, shout out to my wife, because she was one who kind of saw some changes in me, and was like, hey, how are you dealing with this? How are you? And it's not just dealing with this. How are you dealing with, being there for other people? Because, even being, befriending and being really good friends with a lot of guys who I've served with, whether it be soldiers or, mentors, they've gone through their own things. We bounce things off each other, but, sometimes you take on their emotion too. How am I deflecting that while also still listening? Right. And I had to learn to put tools in my toolkit that work for me. And that took some time, but it's definitely been a journey and continues to be a journey. And one of the reasons I definitely wanted to come on here and talk to you about that is because I think that's important. I think a lot of the great people I've already heard you talked about their journeys and experience and what's worked for them. And as part of that, for me, it's been the journey of figuring out what works for me, because I've figured out what works for a lot of other people until like now, where it's like, okay, this is what works for me, right?
Yeah, I see. Man, you brought out a good number of things. So I'll try and go back, and I want to, ask like,
yeah.
So working in a forward deployed hospital, on staff, doing the administrative role and just running that and seeing the people that are coming through. So you're visually looking at trauma on a daily basis. And
Yeah. So I was in 4 aid stations out in Kandahar, and yeah, I mean, obviously my medics were the ones who were first on, to be visually, present, in terms of taking care of obviously our soldiers, but then also, local Afghanistan, people who were in sector. But yeah, the visual trauma of things, right? Whether it be a U.S. soldier or someone else, it's like you have to deal with the visual traumas of that. And so seeing that on a week to week, month to month, daily basis is, it weighs on you a little bit.
Yeah. So with that being said, understanding that it weighs on you, because that's your field, do you feel like you and your soldiers got desensitized to it?
Oh, definitely. I would say most of my soldiers, and most of the people I think um, who work in the healthcare field, whether it be in the military or not. And I've had conversations with many healthcare providers who obviously never served, in the military, but just, in general, working in the ERs across, several health hospitals and health systems, right? Like when you continue to see the trauma, you push through, but then part of it is like you a bit get desensitized to it after a while. It becomes part of your norm, for good or for bad, right? It becomes part of your norm, and you normalize your life around continuing to obviously do your job effectively and efficiently to help, save a life. Um, and but the aftermath of that is like you still have to learn how to decompress from that, right? Because it may not be that first person, second person, third person, but over time, seeing the traumas will, have an effect on you, and you got to learn to decompress. And I would say, and this actually may have been a failure for me, even as a leader. And I think as leaders, we oftentimes have to identify potential failures in ourselves, right? And even our leadership is, while, working with my PA who was amazing, and my doc who was amazing while in Afghanistan, we would have, sessions where we would, definitely decompress, but I don't know if we put enough emphasis on it, right? And because I did have some soldiers, not just medics, but other soldiers who, didn't have, it took a toll on him. It took a toll on him, in a heavy way. And so while I think those decompression sessions and way to cope did help some, I wish I could have been better and more effective to help, more. Well, at least while we were there and immediately after we got home, right? And I think just in general, and this is again whether you're active duty in the military or even after you get out, right? Understanding like you need to have a decompression. You need to decompress at some point to really sort out your thoughts, sort out your feelings in an effective way. I mean, I think that's huge, and there needs to be more emphasis put on it, which is why I love what you're doing right here, because we really need to put an emphasis on that.
I appreciate that, and to kind of hit on the leadership portion of not only you decompressing, but helping your soldiers decompress. What were some of the things that y'all did to decompress?
Yeah, I mean, I think like in all military, whether it be training or anything that happens, you have your after action review, right? And so it was somewhat in that same type of format. We would have a patient come in, with whatever, let's say a gunshot wound, right? Obviously, my medics are doing a great job doing what they need to do to help this person and save their life and get them to the next level of care. But then after that, having a quick huddle, as we're restocking and whatnot, but having a cuddle and be like, everyone okay? Are we okay? Are you good? And what are you feeling right now? And then having a follow up, like whether it be that same week or a couple of days later, and just checking in on the morale of the soldiers. Is everything okay? Here, dealing with things that are going here. What else do you have going on that maybe at home or whatever that's compiling onto that, right? And really just keeping tabs on kind of the emotional well-being of those guys, because and some would share, right? Some would share, kind of how they're feeling, things they're thinking about. I would say, there was an incident we had, where our fob got mortared, right, and we ended up losing a couple of our soldiers, and that definitely weighed very heavy on a lot of the guys, right? And so, especially in that moment when you lose one of your own, right? You really sit there and you kind of think through, okay, how is this? Because now you're losing a friend, and we really had to have those kind of sit down sessions, like, are you okay? Thankfully, by the end of at least the time I was on, in Afghanistan, we ended up getting, behavioral health specialists who actually were in sector, and guys, if they wanted to talk, they could talk to them. If they didn't feel good talking to me or my platoon sergeant or one of the leadership, right? But it was just a constant check-in. It never was. Sometimes it was kind of like a huddled session, right? But it was more of a constant check-in, just to make sure, hey, are you guys doing okay? Do we want to talk about how you feeling? What do we need to do? We'll try to do some, when we can, off time fun things to make sure guys aren't just kind of focused on, that one thing in that moment, so we can kind of distract their minds for a second. But yeah, it's a constant check-ins, man.
Gotcha. Okay, I like that whole portion when you talk about, the leadership putting somewhat of an emphasis on it and having that check-in and having it in the AAR type format. I think that's really good and powerful. I know for most other units that are, combat focused, our AARs and those check-ins are different.
Mm-hmm.
The tempo in which, we're moving to complete the next mission and get the guys ready, that's not really a big emphasis at check-in.
Yeah.
And I also see, and it's a common theme where throughout what you're going through, and throughout your military career, people tend to not want to open up for fear of it might hurt their career progress.
No, that's true. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a real fear in the military is just kind of, being vulnerable in a way, right? And look, I had that same issue. Look, it wasn't until very recently, well after I've been out, and I'd still have the same issue, right? You don't want to be vulnerable, in your emotion. I think I just got to a point where, especially when you're having conversations with, other guys, like my friends who some are still in, some are out, and kind of what they're still dealing with, what their soldiers are dealing with. And it's interesting now that we're in where kind of society is and being in a global pandemic, right? And you're seeing non-military members and kind of them dealing with some of the grief and trauma of just this pandemic. It has nothing to do with the military, right? But I think some of the same coping mechanisms and the conversations are, very similar. And by putting an emphasis on, focusing on your mental health, those, what are those coping mechanisms? How are you dealing with the grief of what you're going through right now, or compounded what you've gone through over time that you've just been kind of piling on, right? Figuring out those tools that work. It's putting that emphasis on that is so crucial, now more than ever. And especially for me, really having a revelation of that is like now more than ever is helping others to find their way of kind of dealing with all of it, just as how I've kind of continued to deal with it.
Gotcha. You said earlier that for you, someone noticed something different in you. And so when a person is dealing with grief and PTSD, what are some of the signs that or cues that you can pick up on directly, for yourself to know that you're dealing with it, as well as outside looking in?
Yeah. So I'll start with the outside looking in, because that's, I think, what also helped shape me looking internally, and then also others, even my wife, kind of looking at me. So, obviously I'm still very close to a lot of friends and family, really, who are in the military, and kind of some of the things I've seen, I hate to say your classic signs, but your classic signs, kind of anger, I think is a big one, right? Kind of the short temper, you kind of get short tempered, right? Drinking, those who may not have drank before who are now drinking, those who drank a little bit but drink a lot now. I've definitely seen in others, some levels of even drug use, right? And depression, where they always lit up a room every time you saw them, now their light is a little bit dimmer, and you can kind of see that, especially if you've known them for a while. Even in how people talk, and this is why it's really important to really kind of pay attention to not just kind of the overt, signs, right? It's like those subtle signs in how people are talking about life, family, comparing that to how they used to talk about life and family, right? And I've seen that in others, and I've had conversations with, some of my soldiers, and as well as, family who've dealt with their own, issues with PTSD and grief. And then taking that, right? My wife was one who, again, I could tell you as me personally, I've always been I'm a glass half full all the time guy. I've always been that way. I'm the most optimistic. I try to find the silver lining in probably the bleakest of situations, right? And there was a moment in time when kind of my wife, I was a bit of a pessimist. I'm not going to lie, which is it was very different, a different character trait for me, get in a certain period of time. And at that time, my wife is like, you're being a little bit pessimistic about, and it could be small stuff, right? It's like, it's not even big things. It's like small things. And as I was kind of going through law school and then even practicing, like there was just like little things, in my personal life. And my wife's like, are you all right? And I'm like, yeah, I'm good. I'm good. And I probably felt like I was, but it was one of those things. It's like you've been pushing whatever you're feeling, and it was like, oh, military stuff, oh, family stuff, kind of pushing it down and layering it on and not dealing with it. And so it wasn't until she kind of brought that to my attention, in a very real conversation, and was like, okay, yeah, let's, now I need to like be vocal and openly talk about the things I'm thinking, the things I'm, addressing. Um, and I would say for me, it was even taking, going back to the military pieces of it, right? There are certain images you just remember in your head, good and bad. And so I remember some fantastic things from a military time, with my soldiers and, with staff and mentors. And then there are certain things that weighed me down, even later on in life, seeing, some of the death, seeing some of the destruction. Um, and it's like, okay, I never dealt with that. And until you deal with it, it's just going to sit on you. And that sat on me. And I think that was like what kind of led to a little bit of that pessimism creeping in and changing me a little bit. And until I dealt with it head on and had an open conversation, not just with others, but with myself, and that I was able to kind of move forward and kind of really deal with the grief and trauma and what I was dealing with, internally.
Got you. And I appreciate you saying that. This is the part that I was going to ask you. Have that conversation with yourself to really deal with it. And so to be able to, one, accept someone else saying, hey, there's something about you that's different, and
Mm-hmm.
picking up on that cue, internally, and then asking yourself that question, what am I dealing with? And being able to acknowledge the good and the bad memory,
Yeah.
and work through them. I think that's key.
Yeah, and having that conversation with yourself is so important, because I feel like, again, I don't know if it's just men, it's black men, it's military people in the military in general. Like, we tend to push off like dealing with emotion, conflict, in certain circumstances, in order to keep on going with whatever the mission is, whatever the task is, right? To continue our, whether it be career progression, personal goals and whatnot. And again, that perseverance I think is important, and to be able to do that is great. And those who can do it effectively it's fantastic. But there comes to a point where you need to kind of deal with the raw emotion of things. You need to deal with whatever that issue was that you just kind of push down and say, all right, because it doesn't always just roll off your back, right? Sometimes it sits on your back, and now you're carrying it through whatever else you're going through, and it'll weigh you down over time. And having that kind of internal dialogue, with yourself, like, all right, man, like what's really going on? And I had some friends who, having the conversation with them, and it wasn't even about myself. It was having the conversation with them about what they're going through currently, whether it be coming off of their last deployment, transitioning out of the military and things they're going through, family stuff, right? Family issues, whether military spouse or otherwise. And then you're kind of, it's interesting because you're kind of taking on their emotion too. And if you haven't figured out how to listen but deflect the emotion, like understand, be sympathetic, be empathetic, but not carry that emotion, and deal with it, then now you're piling on, right? And it got to a point where it's like, look, I gotta hit pause for a second. I gotta have a conversation with myself and say, okay, what am I thinking about? What am I doing? What's weighing me down? What can I let go of? That's the other thing. It's like you're dealing with it, but then you got to let go of some stuff, right? Or else you're just going to be weighed down. And for me, like, that conversation with myself was pertinent. It was pertinent. And then getting back to like the first point, I was talking when we started, is figuring out the tools that I had thought I put in my toolkit that worked for me. A lot of which was kind of persevere and drive on, push down until you explode, really, but it's push down and continue to go. That helped in many ways, don't get me wrong, But then I had to learn, like, look, that was something, like, even whilst I think therapy works for a lot of people. So I don't, I think therapy is great for a lot of people. For me, having this type of dialogue, especially like, Greg, you and I have known each other for a while, with people who you really trust and confide in, y'all can bounce off, you know, ideas, have a very candid conversation. That is therapeutic to me personally. And the reason why it's been therapeutic to me is because, for many years I just pushed down, had no dialogue about it, right? Because that's what I saw, my dad do. That's what I saw my grandfather do. That's what I saw even some of my friends and family members do. They just kind of push down and don't talk about it. And it's like, okay, they weren't really dealing with it, but they kept driving. They kept doing great. They're amazing people.
Yeah.
But then I'm sure whether I saw it or not, they've had their kind of explosion of emotion.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I never got to that level of explosion of emotion. But, when you start to, things start to change, you're like, okay, let's have a conversation with myself and then with others to help me change.
Let's talk about that for a minute. The collateral damage of dealing with trauma and grief. Because when you keep it inside and you hit a point of having to let it go,
Mm-hmm.
I know for some people, and for me personally, I initially felt that if I let it go, I was losing that thought or that memory of the person that was associated with that
Mm-hmm.
pain, guilt, or frustration. And so I felt like that was my burden to carry, right, as a consequence to life.
All right.
So let's talk about the collateral damage.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy because I think it's almost like without knowing it, you feel like carrying the emotion, carrying that trauma, carrying that grief also serves as like a badge of honor in some way, right? Because it's like you don't even know, like, but you're like carrying it, like, but I gotta keep it. I gotta keep it because if I keep it, I can always feel it and I can use that emotion and channel it to something else, right? Which I think you can, to some degree. But you would be, I think, in my opinion, and the way I've dealt with things and the way I've seen some others deal with things, so much better off when you can kind of understand kind of what that emotion is, figure out how to deal with it, but then release the negativity around it, right? Whether it be a death, whether it be your own personal experience, whether it be a career challenge, whatever it is, right? The issue that's at hand. The PTSD in particular, there are certain aspects where you're going to be dealing with some of the negative raw emotion of an experience, but you can utilize that, you can change it, you can release the negative, but still remember the other aspects of what you went through to be able to channel yourself in a positive direction, to be able to channel your thoughts, your feelings, your actions in a positive way. And I think that's what I had to learn, and that's what I've been learning is there's some stuff you just gotta let go. You gotta let go of, man, because if you keep holding on to it, because that's the thing, it's like, especially as military members, right? And look, I didn't do 20 years, so I can't imagine what guys who were in worse situations than I ever been in, who spent a lifetime in the military, kind of all the things that they are piling on over time, right? And then you transition out, and now you're just in life. So, but there's still stuff that's going to pile on, and if you're not releasing some of the negative, you're not going to forget it. I think that's what we think we're going to forget. I'm never going to forget, the guys that I served with. I'm never going to forget, what we did, how we felt, who we affected. You're not going to forget that stuff.
Yeah.
But you can release the negative energy. You can release that, negative emotion that's attached to it. I lost while I was over in Afghanistan, I lost one, I say personal soldier, one of my medics. He and I internalized that a lot. Is Brian Bowman, amazing guy, amazing medic, and that I internalized that, and it was tough for a long time, even after I transitioned out, right? And it got to a point where it's like, then you start adding on other stuff and stressors, but it like exacerbates that moment and the grief that I felt, from losing him, as a medic. And I had to think about, really talking to myself. It's like, I'm not going to forget. I can let go of the pain or the disappointment in losing him, the sadness that I felt. And I can't imagine, he had a wife and family, I can't imagine what, how they even felt.
Yeah.
But that sadness that I had, I was like, at some point I have to let that go. I'm always going to remember him and how, amazing person he was. Right. I carried that same, I will tell you, I carried that same kind of emotion when, our dear sister, Emily, when she passed, right. Who was a key person in me even going med service corps. Right. I carried that for a while too. And I had to let some of that go and remember the things that in the short time that I've known her, that she taught me, whether it was at the academy or after she got out, and the conversations that we had, remembering all those positive moments and having a trajectory that way, because holding on to that kind of sadness that was in there, it was weighing me down. And life happens, like other stuff's going to get piled on, right? You're going to go through other experiences. And at some point you literally have to let that negative raw emotion go, decompress, deal with it in a way that you can continue to move forward, because it's just going to weigh you down.
So listening to you, right, with all of this it is therapeutic in itself, just to be able to talk with someone that you're close to and, just allow yourself to open up. When you say let go, when you say release, what comes to mind is forgiveness. And so being able to have that internal conversation with yourself and forgive yourself for whatever reason you're holding on to.
Yeah.
That negative aspect is key, is a big thing. I know for a while it was hard for me to even say Emily's name without these bad memories and images coming up and this feeling of guilt that, that I wasn't there to protect her.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've always been being there and protecting my family and friends that I love. That's one of my big things that, that I stand on. That's what, identifies me as a man. And so not being able to be there and keep her safe, that was my guilt that I carried for a while. And so when you talk about letting it go and releasing, it really is being able to forgive yourself. And
it is, man. It is. I had with Emily and others, I had the same feeling. So with Emily, it was less of the protector, right? Because in a way, she was my big sister. I think she was a big sister to many who came after her at West Point. But she was a big sister, and we both, being in PG County and having that connection, in high school and whatnot. We grew really close. And for me, what I had to let go was the fact that I didn't have that, what I thought in my head, like I didn't have that last experience with her. I didn't have that last conversation. I didn't say to her, thank you. You're one of the reasons I was able to kind of get through this challenge, the academy, go transition into the military effectively. I never had, it's almost, I held on to that for a little while. I was like, I just didn't get that opportunity. And that thought became negative, right? And it's like, but then having that conversation with myself was like, but I had all these other experiences with her. I had all these other conversations. It's okay. That's all right. Like, God allowed me to have the experience with her that he wanted me to have with her. and that she had an impact on me, and hopefully I had, an impact on her in some way, shape, or form. And I think the same thing, even going through, my time in the military and even afterwards, right? There are those times where, and I think, again, my medic, Brian Bowman, you know, I didn't have that last, did I do enough? That question, did I do enough to protect? I will say in that position, it was like to protect him. You know, I was the one, myself, as well as our commander, and was the one who sent them out, with a platoon to, be on a mission. Did I make the right decision? I'm like, well, I know I made the right decision because he was a damn good medic. He was integrated in that platoon. He was amazing. But you second guess yourself, and it's like, did I cause that? And it's like, I didn't. But you hold on to it like you did. I had a good friend, Tyler Parton, who passed while we were both deployed in Afghanistan together. We weren't even, we were in the same brigade, but not in the same company or even battalion. But he lost his life while we were in Afghanistan, unfortunately, to a sniper. And I will tell you that weighed on me heavy too, because look, even up to the day that we left to deploy to Afghanistan, like me and him were hanging out, we had drinks, and then you have those same questions. Man, I wish I could have had this next experience with him. We should have been closer. We should have had more drinks. We should have did this. We should have did that. And it's like that weighs on you because it's like that uncertainty. And it's like, it got to a point where I had to just kind of you got to let go. You got to say, you know what? We had a great friendship. I got to know him. I got to know my soldiers. I got to know Emily in a way that I will forever be changed in my life. And I just had to let go of those questions of the who's, the what's, the whys, so that I can continue to remember them, continue to remember the impact they have on me, but release the negative. And that was, to your point, the forgiveness. It's forgiving myself for, not doing that enough, if you will. It's God intended for the experience that we went through to be there. And I have to be okay with that. And be able to continue. I won't forget. I'm never going to forget Emily. I'm never going to forget Brian. I'm never going to forget Tyler. I'm never going to forget any of the guys that I've served with. And I got to be okay with, especially those who unfortunately lost. I got to be okay with not thinking I did enough, even if I did, even if we did, even if our unit did, right? There are certain things and unfortunate circumstances that if you don't let go, you're going to hold on to forever, and it's not going to allow you to break out and go to, continue moving on with your life in a positive way.
I like how you put all of that, because it sounds like you ended up having to humble yourself and acknowledge God and your faith to be able to process that and let it go. So in saying that, God gave us, the time that he wanted us to have to at least appreciate those good moments, is the ones that you didn't get to share. And so before you say
no, yeah.
I just wanted to look and, to the next of you, you have faith on one side, and then on the other side, don't be ordinary.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so, it's kind of like what this process is about, when you're dealing with trauma and grief, is to have that faith and to be humble and to continue to move forward with your life because you're still living it, and not to be ordinary, because you have to value who you are, what you are, and honor, those people that aren't here by being extraordinary. And
right.
About, the time you do have.
Yeah, man, look, I really did have to humble myself in so many ways. And, I am a man of faith. I do believe, God has an intention on my life and has taken me through my journey and my path, and there were times when I kind of strayed away from him. And then, he has a way of drawing you back in, right? But in those moments, and really, I would say, when I started to figure out again the tools that I needed to put in my toolkit, and not a lot, for me, it wasn't a bunch, right? But the tools I needed for myself to deal with the raw emotion, the grief, the trauma of, whether this, military, but even kind of some personal stuff that I had gone through in life, right? I had to more so than ever, like lean on my faith of, and like you said, humble yourself and say, look, there are certain things that were literally just out of my control. I can't hold on to it as if I could have helped to get to a different outcome. I couldn't. Did I do enough in that situation? 9 times out of 10, yes. And even that 1 out of 10, you probably had no control over any of it. Right. And so I had to really, lean on and say, and talk to myself, but talk to God. Like, God, like, why? You ask like yourself that question. Why? Even those who are not, of faith, or, are not Christian, I think everyone asked themselves that question. Why this? Why now? Why me? Right. And so, and me asking it was kind of me asking God, like, man, what could I have done? Why was it me who had to deal with X, Y, or Z? You know, why now? Why now am I dealing with this? Dealing with this emotion, um, and what can I do? And it really had. I mean, again, I had literally had to have a verbal a conversation with myself, and just like, hey, it. I was probably talking to myself, but also talking to God, and it's like, look, I have put you on this earth to do a number of different things, and you're continuing on that journey. And along your journey, you have met and experienced a bunch of different people who have affected you in, great and positive ways, and some negative situations, and they've all been a test of your character, built you up. Um, but every moment is, you're going to carry every moment, but you don't have to carry the negative emotion of it. You don't have to carry the uncertainty forever. And the reason you don't have to carry the uncertainty forever is because know that, and this is, this is God, know that God is leading you on this path. Just as you have a journey, He has a journey for other people, right? And while your paths may cross and you impact each other, if that path, their journey ends early and yours continues to go, don't sit and think about what you could have done to help their journey go farther, that y'all could be aligned, because that might not have been in the cards. That might not have been what He had intended. And I had to figure that out to be able to release. I had to have that conversation with myself and with God to be able to be like, you know what, you're right. I can't affect everything around me.
Yeah.
And that, that's where I got my optimism back. That's where I got that joy back, because I was able to like just let go of some stuff, man.
Got you. So earlier you spoke on changes in people. So folks being angry, increase in drinking,
Yep.
abuse, depression, and even how people talk. All of those are signs of destructive behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
So what caused you to correct your destructive behaviors, and what advice would you give someone else for theirs?
I would say too, a couple things. Pay attention, especially for, and I've had conversation with friends, especially those who are transitioning, right? Pay attention to yourself, and like really pay attention to yourself and your changes. And I'm telling you, it's going to be subtle in the beginning. It's going to be small. Like, look, changes in what your daily routine and habits are. Like even the most minute things. What do you do first in the morning normally? Are you starting to sleep a little bit longer than you normally, would have or should? Because those are going to be those subtle signs. Um, how you eat. I really do, like what you feed your body will affect your Your physical state will affect your emotional and mental state, right? So are you now feeding your body negative stuff? Are you now eating like crap, more often than not? Are you drinking a lot more? I would say a good number, man, of people that I've experienced who've gone, dealt with their own depression and grief. One of their big things was drinking. And I would say, because I saw that in so many other people, and even family members of mine who were dealing with things, and you know, even in the military, right?
Uh-huh.
When you see them going through it, if you grasp it, you can actually look back to yourself and say, oh, wait, hold on. Let me make sure that I'm not doing this. And then also having those candid conversations with friends. I really do. It was that old saying, right? When you're a kid, it takes a village to raise a child. You still need that same village. You still need a village around you as you continue to grow in life. Look, we have a amazing friendship, and we have our group of guys we really care for each other. Well, you can, when we go out, I can see when things change in you. You can see when things change in me.
Yeah.
And being able to continue to connect with those around you so that they can kind of point out, like, hey, man, you all right? Something's a little off. I think those two things, like looking to see those like subtle changes. And as you have conversations with other people, be candid. Because that's who you are, right? You are who you are. And so being able to be candid with others, even if it's a small subset, they can, iron sharpens iron, right? So they can sharpen you to make sure you're okay. You're coping with whatever you need to cope with, dealing with whatever the emotion and grief and trauma that you're dealing with. And they can also help and be a resource. I think the other thing for me, as part of dealing, the changes that I saw, was also coming to a realization that I don't have to do anything by myself.
Mm-hmm.
I have some great family, friends, people, colleagues around me who have shared experiences, similar experiences, and we can help each other. And that help could be just a conversation, right? But you don't have to go through whatever you're going through by yourself. And I was able to utilize that again as a tool for myself. And hey, let me just make sure, you say do an azimuth check on myself. I'm like, am I going in the right direction? Am I making sure I'm dealing with, the stuff that life throws at me in a positive way? Am I checking my own mental health, right? So I would say probably the biggest thing that helped me though in identifying things in myself was also staying attuned to others. The things that I saw in other people. Hell, going back to like my dad, seeing things when I was growing up and remembering those, the traumatic things he went through, and like, oh wait, hold on. Now, I'm a little older, a little wiser. Now, when he did this, was it because he was persevering, or was he trying to figure out emotionally what the issues? Friends that are still in the military who've gotten out, same thing. We have the same conversations. We go out to dinner. Our families go out to dinner. Just you see how they change if they've changed, right? You know that they used to always play basketball. Now they don't do it anymore. Or they always worked out. Now they don't do it anymore. They never drank. Now they drink a lot. You know what I'm saying? And you kind of gotta just make sure they're okay. But in doing that, it'll also, because you're so attuned to kind of them, it'll also make sure that you're attuned to yourself too, and what's affecting you and how you should address those issues that are affecting you.
With that, let's talk about seeking professional help.
Okay.
Have you had to seek help, or did you seek help? And if so, tell us about your counseling, your experience.
So I don't think I never, obviously as a veteran, I go to the VA and, for checks and just general health and welfare checks, right? But I don't think I ever sought professional help. And I think that was personal choice for me. I leaned more so on those around me who were very close to me. to be able to have those candid conversations that I needed to have to kind of move forward and deal with things. That being said, I I think that those who feel comfortable enough should seek professional help. Seeking a counselor, whether it be a one-on-one or some type of group therapy, I think it's beneficial because what I've gotten out of the conversations I've had, it literally is the very act of having a very candid conversation, um, processing, not by way of like someone telling you should do this, you shouldn't do this, but probing questions, like having people around you who can probe questions to you and say, well, what do you think about this? What about that? Why do you think you felt that way? When you don't, if you don't have those people around you who can do it, definitely seeking a therapist, I think would beneficial for a lot of people. And I think it is pertinent in whether you're in the military or whether outside the military, right? And whether you're dealing with grief and trauma and PTSD from from the military, or whether you're dealing with the stuff that's happening right now in society, right? You know what I'm saying? The with everything that's going on in society, especially for the Black community, for the Asian community as well, in terms of discrimination, Latinx community. Um, they're all processing and dealing with things, and you may need to seek someone to really help you dig in to how do I deal with and process these emotions. And so being able to confide in someone, and that might be a professional counselor, that might be a therapist, a psychiatrist, psychologist, it's beneficial. Mm-hmm. Because again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of you can't just hold on to all of that emotion, because it's going to manifest itself in one way, shape, or form. And at some point in time, when it becomes too much and you haven't dealt with it, it's going to explode. And you don't want to get to that point. So you want to be able to head that off early. Have this conversation.
What advice would you give your younger self?
Man, ask a lot of questions. Ask a lot of questions. Especially on life lessons, right? Because again, I go back to growing up, watching my dad, deal with certain things in the military and outside of it. My grandfather, uncles, aunts, my mom, right? And you see them dealing with stuff. And I say dealing with, you just see like whatever you never had a real conversation. Well, at least I didn't. But it would have been good to have that conversation. And maybe I wouldn't have got it then, but I would have gotten it now, right? And I'm going back and having those conversations. Yeah. So, but asking the questions. I think the other thing is understanding that there are certain things in life that you don't have control over. That's in everything. That's in life. And that is, as a man of faith, I have to really, lean on God to say, okay, you're charting my journey, right? And there's certain things that, not just certain things, He's charted the journey. I don't have control over, all the things around me all the time. I can control what I can control, and I can't be weighed down and internalize all of the things that I can't control. And for so long, it was, you think like, no, I should have been able to do X. I should have been able to do Y. I could have done better. And to some extent, probably true. I probably could have been better at X, Y, or Z. But then some stuff, it's like I literally had no control over what the outcome was going to be. So if I understood that early on, I might not have internalized and had to deal with like the negative emotion and trauma and that came with that. And so that's probably one of the biggest things I would tell myself is like you can only control what you can control.
So. Well, just to wrapping up Are there any resources or efforts out there that you're doing that you would like to share? Any projects you're working on?
Yeah, man. Look, nothing specific that I would say I'm doing, but I've through my law practice and through other efforts that I've nonprofits that I've helped or at least know about. There are so many resources out there, for all the veterans who are out there. I mean, I would say, in particular, get connected with one your local VA, but then two, there are associations and groups that will help you to connect to various resources. So, the National Veterans Legal Association, right? There are just so many. The Veterans Consortium is another one. So many organizations out there that can be in and of themselves a resource, but then connect veterans to resources. A lot of nonprofits, I would say, even outside of the grief and trauma and stuff and emotion in terms of from a military perspective, life in general. Look, there's a lot of us who have transitioned out who now dealing with the current times and racism. There are resources out there that will help to channel some of that energy in a positive way. Resources out there that could, a person could get connected to again, um, have a conversation. Again, that's on the local and federal level. But there's just so many things. I can say that there's not one thing that I'm personally doing or connected with, but there are things, organizations I've worked with, and I named a couple. But even outside of that, I would say there's one more that I want to put out there, and it is not specifically for PTSD, but breast cancer. And I'm mentioning this because there are many military members that I know that have gotten out and have dealt with their own set of healthcare issues that have also affected their mental health, right? And so working with nonprofits such as like Nancy's Gift, working with the Komen Foundation, right? And those resources are critical because now you're not only taking care of your physical self, you're taking, that affects your mental self, right? And so, for anyone who's listening to this, just know that there are many resources out there, and get connected sooner rather than later. You don't have to go through stuff by yourself. There are other people who can help you. And this podcast is great because I think it's going to be a way to connect the dots for a lot of people.
Man, Marshall, I appreciate you coming on, brother, and sharing with us and, giving that words of wisdom and encouragement out there.
I appreciate you having me, man. No, I love this. I love this conversation. I would say 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have had this conversation. I wasn't in the mental space to do it. So I appreciate the position I'm in now, the space I'm in, and that you have me on, man. It's been great.
Any last words of encouragement or words of wisdom?
Hey, I just want to say that for you, brother, this has been amazing what you are doing in pushing awareness for our men and women who have served, and making sure that mentally, physically, emotionally, they're taking care of themselves and connecting to the resources. I think this is amazing, and opening up the dialogue. I think for some, you're going to hear, and sometimes when you hear other people and kind of what they went through or things they've thought about, it not to piggyback off the name, but it helps them put their guard down to be able to have those additional conversations and connect to the resources they needed. And again, like I said earlier, figure out, for those who are going through something, dealing with stress, dealing with trauma, dealing with grief, figuring out the tools that will work for you is so critical, so important, because it'll help you to decompress, and not just compartmentalize. It'll help you to release a lot of that emotion that we feel in any given moment. And it'll allow you not to compile a bunch of situations, circumstances on top of each other, which just is going to exacerbate kind of what you're going through.
That's it for this week's episode of Guards Down. We are counting on you to join us in the mission of spreading awareness about trauma and complicated grief. Be sure to give us an honest review, subscribe, and share with someone this could help. Catch you next week.